Welcome aboard. Your seats are right this way.
Dad, it's so beautiful.
Enjoy every second.
Look, Dad, we're really flying first class.
Yes, sweetheart, you deserve it.
Excuse me.
Can I help you?
What are you doing here?
This is a public flight.
That seat isn't yours.
I believe you're mistaken.
Dad.
I'm right here.
One moment, please.
What's happening?
Is there a problem?
Did we do something wrong?
No, sweetheart. I don't think this flight should leave yet.
What's happening? I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, everyone must deplane immediately.
This is ridiculous. Ma'am, please, we need to evacuate.
No delays. Move now. Sir, thank you for waiting.
Let's begin.
Patrick Herman felt the woman's shadow before he heard her voice. "Excuse me, that seat isn't yours." He looked up slowly. Stephanie Miller stood in the aisle in a dark green suit that cost more than his last 3 paychecks combined. One manicured finger pointed at the window seat beside him. Behind her, a flight attendant hovered, clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield. Zoe's hand found his sleeve and gripped it. Patrick didn't answer right away. He'd learned, 4 years ago, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and goodbye, that some silences say more than any argument could. He held this one now, letting it stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone but him. "Sir," the flight attendant's voice cracked slightly. "Would you mind stepping out so we can sort this?" Around them, the first-class cabin had gone quiet in that specific way. A room goes quiet when it senses a show is starting. A businessman 2 rows up lowered his newspaper an inch. A woman across the aisle stopped scrolling her phone. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Patrick could feel the weight of being watched settle over him like a second jacket. Zoe pulled her backpack tighter against her chest, chin dropping toward her collarbone. Patrick reached for his boarding pass with 2 fingers, unhurried, and held it up so the flight attendant could see it without him having to say a word. Stephanie laughed. Not loud, just enough. People dressed like that don't usually fly this cabin. Somebody behind them exhaled sharply, the kind of exhale that means, "oh no," without saying it out loud. Patrick looked down at his jacket. Charcoal, a little worn at the cuffs, the last birthday gift his wife ever bought him. He didn't explain that. He wasn't going to hand this woman a reason to feel sorry for insulting him. He simply folded the boarding pass back into his lap and said, quiet enough that only the people closest could hear, "I believe you're mistaken." 24 hours earlier, none of this would have made sense to him either. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I've got another unforgettable story coming your way soon. Before we jump back in, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and who's listening from around the world. Now, let's get back to the story. The apartment had been small and warm that night, cluttered in the comfortable way homes get when 2 people build a life in them and one stays behind to keep building alone. Patrick stood at the ironing board pressing the same charcoal jacket he pulled out for anything that mattered, humming along to nothing in particular, while Zoe narrated her packing list from the next room like a flight controller. Socks, check. Backpack, check. Lucky pencil, check. He smiled at that. She'd carried that pencil to every robotics meet since 3rd grade, and it hadn't once let her down, at least not in any way she'd admit. On the shelf above the ironing board sat a photograph in a plain frame, his wife laughing at something off camera, a candle beside it that hadn't been lit in months because he kept forgetting and kept meaning to fix that. She used to talk about flying somewhere together one day. No particular place, just the two of them, and enough room to stretch their legs for once. Cancer had made sure that trip never happened. So when Zoe got the letter inviting her robotics team to Washington, Patrick had done the math on overtime shifts and skipped vacations until the numbers finally allowed for something neither of them had ever had: first class. Not because he needed the extra legroom, because some promises don't expire just because the person you made them to isn't around to collect. He hadn't told Zoe yet. He wanted to see her face when she found out. The airport the next morning gave him that. Zoe pressed her palm to the glass, watching planes taxi past with the particular focus only a 10-year-old with a competition on her mind can manage. When Patrick handed her the boarding pass and pointed at the seat number, she read it twice before it landed. First class? Dad, are you serious? He was serious. He didn't tell her how many double shifts it cost. Some math a father keeps to himself. She hugged him hard enough to knock the wind out of him, right there by the gate, and for one full second, Patrick let himself believe the day was going to be simple. Back on the plane, it wasn't. The flight attendant had checked both boarding passes by then and found exactly what Patrick already knew: his seat, his name. Nothing to argue about. For one breath, the whole thing looked over. Then Stefani mentioned, almost as an aside, that her firm was 3 weeks from closing a travel contract worth more to this airline than every seat on the plane combined. The cabin supervisor arrived within 90 seconds. He didn't look at Patrick's boarding pass either. He looked at Stephanie's watch, her jewelry, the confidence in how she stood, and made a decision that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with math he thought he understood. "Sir, we're going to need you to relocate." Zoe's grip on his sleeve tightened again. "Dad," she whispered, so quiet it barely reached him. "Did we do something wrong?" Patrick looked at his daughter, then at the supervisor, then at Stefani, who had already turned her attention to her phone, like the matter was settled. "No, sweetheart," he said. "Some people just forget that kindness is worth more than money." He stood, gathered their bags, and let the supervisor lead them toward the jet bridge, without another word of protest. Nobody on that plane understood why he looked so calm. Nobody understood that in exactly 5 minutes, calm wasn't going to be the only thing that changed. Patrick didn't look back at the cabin as he walked. Looking back was for people who needed the room to remember them. The jet bridge felt colder than the plane, all metal and fluorescent light, the hum of it swallowing most conversation. A young airline employee walked a step behind them, tablet in hand, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment he'd been handed. Zoe kept glancing over her shoulder, back toward the aircraft door, like she expected someone to change their mind and call them back. "They're going to move us somewhere worse," she said. Not really a question. "Maybe," Patrick said. "Doesn't mean we got smaller." She frowned at that, filed it away, the way she filed away most things he said that she didn't fully understand yet, and kept walking. Inside the cabin, the show wasn't over. It had simply changed shape. Stephanie settled into the window seat that had never been hers, smoothing her jacket, already scrolling through emails like the last 90 seconds hadn't happened. A businessman 2 rows back leaned toward his neighbor, voice pitched just low enough to pretend it was private. Guy was probably trying to get a free upgrade. Happens all the time. His neighbor nodded like that explained everything. Nobody had checked. Nobody was going to. The story had already been decided, and Patrick's actual boarding pass, verified twice, wasn't going to compete with a suit that fit and a jacket that didn't. Near the galley, the cabin supervisor pulled up the digital seating chart on his handheld device. His thumb hovered over the reassignment field for a second longer than it should have, the pause of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do and was choosing to do it anyway. He typed a reason code: voluntary downgrade, passenger request. Nobody asked Patrick if that was true. Nobody was going to. A junior flight attendant near the back watched the supervisor's screen change and said nothing, but her jaw tightened, and she quietly angled her own tablet, capturing the original chart before it refreshed. She didn't know why she did it. She just knew something about it felt wrong enough to save. Back on the jet bridge, Patrick stopped walking. The young employee escorting them glanced at his tablet, at the same seating record now displaying its rewritten version, and something in his expression flickered. "When was this last updated?" Patrick asked, calm, like he was asking about the weather. The employee hesitated, looked at the screen, looked at Patrick, said nothing. Patrick nodded once, unbothered, and let his eyes move past the man to the small terminal kiosk a few feet away, the one displaying flight status and gate information on a public loop. He angled his phone toward it without making a production of it, the same way he'd photograph a receipt or a parking sign, and captured the timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen. Then the employee's ID badge, still clipped to his lanyard, catching the fluorescent light for half a second longer than most people would notice. Zoe watched him do it and didn't ask why. She'd learned that when her father did something quietly, there was usually a reason worth waiting for. "You're not upset," she said instead. "I'm plenty upset," Patrick said. "I'm just not going to let it drive." She almost smiled at that. Almost. He pulled out his phone again, this time to make a call. It lasted 11 seconds. Whoever answered didn't get much from him beyond a single sentence, delivered without heat, without urgency, like he was confirming a dinner reservation instead of setting something in motion. "I don't think this flight should leave yet." He hung up before there could be a reply. Back in the cabin, Stephanie ordered champagne from a flight attendant who didn't quite meet her eyes while pouring it. She raised the glass toward the woman seated beside her, some traveling companion Patrick had never bothered to notice, and said something about people finally learning where they belonged. A few nearby passengers laughed along, the easy kind of laugh people give when agreeing seems safer than staying quiet. Others didn't laugh. One older woman near the aisle looked down at her hands instead, the particular stillness of someone who wanted to say something and didn't. Near the open boarding door, close enough to hear all of it drift through, Zoe stood with her backpack hugged tight against her chest, listening to a stranger celebrate the exact thing that had just happened to her father. She didn't say anything either, but she remembered every word of it. If you've ever watched someone get treated like they don't belong somewhere they earned fair and square, you already know how heavy that kind of silence gets. This channel exists for stories that don't let silence win. If that's the kind of story you needed today, don't just watch it and move on. Hit subscribe right now, while it's still on your mind, because the next person who needs to see someone stand quietly, instead of shrink, might be scrolling past this exact video in an hour. 5 minutes. That was the number Patrick had given nobody but himself, and the clock had already started the moment he stepped off that plane. At first, nothing seemed different. The line for boarding kept moving. A flight attendant checked names off a list at the gate podium. Somewhere behind Patrick, the young employee who'd escorted him off the aircraft kept glancing at his tablet, at the timestamp, at Patrick, like he was starting to understand something he couldn't yet say out loud. Then, without warning, the boarding line stopped. No announcement, no explanation. Just a gate agent's radio crackling to life, her expression shifting from routine to something closer to alarm, and behind her, through the terminal windows, the unmistakable flash of airport security lights pulling up beside the aircraft. Patrick didn't move. He didn't need to. Whatever was about to happen, he'd already made the call. The radio crackle didn't stop. It multiplied. By the time Patrick and Zoe reached the gate lounge, 3 separate voices were speaking over each other on the agent's earpiece, and her hand had gone still on the counter. In that specific way, hands go still when someone is trying very hard not to look alarmed in public. Outside the terminal window, 2 airport operations vehicles pulled up alongside the aircraft, lights rotating without sirens, the kind of quiet urgency that somehow reads louder than noise ever could. A handful of uniformed men and women stepped out, moving with the unhurried purpose of people who did this often enough that panic wasn't part of the job description anymore. Zoe pressed closer to Patrick's side. "Dad, is that because of us?" "No," Patrick said, and meant it. What was coming had very little to do with a seat. Back inside the aircraft, the first sign of trouble was silence. The kind that spreads through a cabin faster than any announcement could, passenger by passenger, as people noticed the boarding door hadn't closed and the safety briefing hadn't started, and the flight attendants had all gathered near the galley, speaking in low, clipped sentences nobody outside their circle could hear. Stephanie noticed last, mostly because she wasn't looking up from her phone. "Excuse me," she said to a passing attendant, not quite as sharp as before. "Are we delayed?" The attendant didn't answer. That, more than anything, told the cabin something had shifted. The captain emerged from the cockpit a minute later, and the lead flight attendant, a woman who had flown with him for 6 years, would later say she'd never seen his face arranged quite like that. Not panicked, focused, in the specific way people get focused when the ground beneath a routine day has quietly given out. He took the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, for safety and compliance reasons, we need every passenger to deplane immediately. Please gather your belongings and proceed to the jet bridge in an orderly manner. We apologize for the inconvenience." For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the cabin erupted into the low, overlapping murmur of 80 people asking the same question at once, none of them getting an answer. A man near the front stood halfway up before sitting back down, uncertain whether standing accomplished anything. A mother 2 rows back pulled her toddler onto her lap like the plane itself might tilt. Stefani stood fully, jaw tight, voice rising above the others. "I have a meeting in 6 hours. What exactly is the safety issue?" No one answered her either. That silence landed differently on her than it had on anyone else, and something in her expression flickered, the first crack in a morning she'd assumed was already over. Passengers filed toward the exit in slow, uneven clusters, dragging bags they'd only just settled into overhead bins, murmuring theories that ranged from mechanical failure to weather to nothing at all. Nobody had the real answer. Nobody would, for a while yet. Out in the gate lounge, Patrick stood near the windows with Zoe, watching the returning stream of passengers spill back into the terminal in states of mild confusion. He hadn't moved from where the young employee had left him. He hadn't needed to. Stephanie spotted him before she reached the gate desk, and for a moment, she simply stopped walking. He looked exactly the same as he had 90 minutes earlier. Same jacket, same posture, same unreadable calm that had irritated her from the first second she laid eyes on him, except now it read differently. Now it sat in her chest, like a question she didn't have the tools to answer. He wasn't scrambling for a rebooked flight. He wasn't on the phone with customer service. He was simply standing there, hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder, watching the chaos unfold with the patience of a man who already knew how it ended. That unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Zoe noticed the shift too, young enough to read a room by instinct, even when she couldn't name what she was reading. "Why isn't she saying anything to you now?" she whispered. "Because she's starting to ask herself a question I already answered a while ago," Patrick said. Before Zoe could ask what that meant, a man in a dark suit crossed the lounge with the brisk, practiced stride of someone used to being recognized before he introduced himself. 2 others followed a step behind, one holding a tablet, the other speaking quietly into a phone that never left her ear. They didn't stop at the gate desk. They didn't stop near Stefani, who straightened instinctively, certain for half a second that whatever explanation was coming would finally be delivered to her. They walked past her entirely. The man in the suit stopped in front of Patrick, extended his hand without hesitation, and said the sentence that would rearrange everything the cabin thought it understood about the last 2 hours. "Mr. Herman, thank you for waiting." Stephanie's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Zoe looked up at her father, searching his face for some kind of explanation, and found only the same steady calm he'd worn since the moment this all began. Whatever was happening, it hadn't started 5 minutes ago. It had been waiting the entire time. The executive didn't wait for Patrick to respond before turning to the small crowd gathering near the gate desk. Airline staff, 2 uniformed inspectors, a woman with a tablet who hadn't looked up from it since arriving. "This is Patrick Herman," he said, loud enough to carry. "Lead investigator on our operational integrity audit team." The words landed across the lounge like something physical. Stephanie's champagne-flushed confidence from an hour earlier had drained out of her completely. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're an investigator." "I am," Patrick said. Nothing more. No triumph in it, no edge. Just a fact, delivered the same way he'd delivered every other sentence that morning. A murmur moved through the passengers still lingering nearby, waiting for rebooking information, half listening to a conversation that had suddenly become more interesting than their delay. The businessman who'd whispered about a free upgrade an hour earlier now stood very still, studying the floor with unusual focus. The executive continued, addressing the small cluster of airline staff who'd gathered. "Mr. Herman's team runs unannounced audits across our international routes. Today's flight was randomly selected before boarding began. Nobody at the gate or in the cabin was informed, by design." Zoe looked up at her father, working through the shape of what she'd just heard. You didn't do this because of the seat?" "No, sweetheart," Patrick said, crouching slightly so he was closer to her eye level. "I didn't plan any of what happened to us, but once it did, I wasn't going to pretend I didn't see it." That answer seemed to settle something in her. She nodded slowly, backpack finally loosening in her grip for the first time in an hour. Stefani found her voice again, sharper now, defensive in the way people get when the ground has shifted and they're grabbing for anything solid. "This is absurd. You can't possibly hold me responsible for how the crew handled a seating question." "I'm not here for you," Patrick said, and turned his attention away from her entirely, which unsettled her more than an argument would have. "I'm here for what the crew did, and why they thought they could." He faced the executive instead. "Before anything else, I need every record from this flight frozen. Seating history, login activity, gate communications, all of it. If it can be edited, someone will try." The instruction moved through the group like current through wire. The woman with the tablet was already typing. Within minutes, a makeshift operations room took shape in a small conference space off the main terminal. Borrowed folding chairs and a single laptop screen, the only furniture that mattered. Patrick sat across from 3 airline representatives. Zoe settled into a chair in the corner with a granola bar someone had found for her, quiet and watchful in the way children get when they sense something important is happening, even if they don't understand all of it. The cabin supervisor arrived 20 minutes later, summoned from wherever he'd gone after the deplaning, visibly unsure why he'd been asked to return. Patrick didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Walk me through the reassignment. Start with why my seat changed." The supervisor's explanation came out clipped, defensive, full of phrases like customer service discretion and standard practice, none of which answered the actual question. Patrick let him talk until he ran out of language that meant anything, then asked the question that mattered. "Did I request a downgrade?" Silence. "The system says voluntary." "I never spoke to you about giving up my seat," Patrick said. "I never spoke to anyone about it, so I'll ask again. Where did voluntary come from?" The supervisor had no answer that survived contact with the frozen record now displayed on the laptop screen, time-stamped, unedited, exactly as it had existed before his thumb ever touched the reassignment field. A knock interrupted the silence. The junior flight attendant from earlier stood in the doorway, hands twisted together, clearly having debated whether to come at all. "I have something," she said. "I don't know if it matters." She held out her own tablet. On the screen, an older version of the seating chart, saved by accident when the cabin device briefly froze before Patrick's original assignment had been touched. Every seat number matched his boarding pass exactly. Every timestamp predated the edited version by nearly 40 minutes. "I saved it because it seemed wrong when it changed," she said quietly. "I didn't know who to tell." Patrick looked at the screen for a long moment before looking back up at her. "You're telling the right person now." The room went still in a different way than before, the stillness of people realizing the ground under the morning story had just been confirmed rather than assumed. He held the challenge every meeting has needed for the airline reps to hear. If watching someone finally get the proof they deserved made you want to see this through to the end, don't wait until the credits to decide. Subscribe now, because stories like this only keep getting made when people like you refuse to scroll past the moment truth finally shows up. On the laptop screen, the original chart still glowed, Patrick's name exactly where it had always belonged. Stefani. standing near the doorway where she'd drifted without quite being invited in, stared at the same screen, and said nothing at all. Whatever composure she'd walked onto that plane with was gone now, replaced by the particular quiet of someone realizing the story had never been about her seat. Patrick closed the laptop gently. "This isn't where it ends," he said, to no one in particular, and everyone in the room at once. "It's where it actually starts." The conference room emptied of everyone except the people who needed to be there. Airline representatives filed out to make calls Patrick didn't ask about. A security officer positioned himself outside the door, not because anyone was under arrest, but because paperwork this significant needed a witness trail of its own. Zoe had fallen asleep in her corner chair, granola bar wrapper still in her fist, the exhaustion of a morning that had asked more of a 10-year-old than any morning should. Patrick draped his jacket over her shoulders and let her sleep through what came next. The airport's regional director arrived without an entourage, which told Patrick more about how seriously this was being taken than any statement could have. She was younger than he expected, sharp-eyed, carrying the kind of tired that comes from a career spent cleaning up messes other people made. "I've read the preliminary summary," she said, taking the seat across from him. "I want to understand what you need from us before this goes any further." "Cooperation," Patrick said, "not performance." She studied him for a moment, then nodded once, like she'd decided something about him that mattered. He didn't waste the opening. "If this airline only follows its own boarding policy when someone with my job title happens to be sitting in seat 2A, then the policy was never real to begin with. I need you to understand that before we go any further, because what I'm about to ask for only works if you believe that." The director didn't argue. She'd clearly heard versions of this conversation before, in other rooms, about other airlines, and something in her posture suggested she was tired of being on the wrong side of it. "What do you need?" "Everything," Patrick said. "Boarding logs from this gate for the past 90 days. Every login tied to seat reassignment authority. Gate camera footage for this flight specifically. And I want to know if this is the first time a reason code like voluntary downgrade has been used without documentation." The director's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That reaction told him more than any answer would have. "I'll have it pulled," she said, and left to make it happen. Patrick sat back, glancing at Zoe, still asleep, still wrapped in his jacket. He thought about the promise that had started all of this, a father wanting his daughter to see the world the way her mother never got to. It felt distant now, buried under folders and timestamps, but it hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened into something he cared about even more. Outside the conference room, word had begun to spread through the terminal in the particular way news travels among strangers, stuck waiting for information nobody's giving them. Passengers from the original flight clustered near the gate, trading half-formed theories, most of them wrong, a few of them getting uncomfortably close to the truth. Stephanie sat apart from the others, phone in hand, though she hadn't dialed anyone in 20 minutes. Every so often her eyes drifted toward the closed conference room door, and each time her expression shifted a little further from the certainty she'd walked onto that plane with. Inside, the junior flight attendant returned, this time accompanied by a compliance officer who'd flagged something during the initial record pull. "There's a pattern," the officer said, sliding a printed sheet across the table. 3 other reassignments this week. Same authorization code, same supervisor. No documentation on any of them. Patrick read the sheet twice. 3 names, 3 seats, 3 decisions that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with who looked like they belonged in first class and who didn't. "Pull the passenger records," he said. "I want to know who lost those seats and why." The officer nodded and left to make it happen, and for the first time since boarding that plane, Patrick felt the shape of the morning change. This had stopped being about him. It had never really been about him at all. Not the seat, not the accusation, not the calm he'd worn like armor through all of it. It was about a system that had quietly decided some passengers mattered more than others and had gotten comfortable enough with that decision to stop hiding it. He thought about the people who didn't have his job title, the ones who got moved without a word of protest because protesting had never worked for them before. the ones who went home and told themselves it was probably nothing, because believing otherwise was too exhausting to carry. The director returned an hour later, a thin folder in hand, expression harder than before. "You were right to ask," she said, setting the folder down without opening it. "It's bigger than one flight." Patrick looked at the folder, then at Zoe, still sleeping soundly in the corner, still wrapped in the jacket that had started this whole morning as nothing more than a father's quiet tribute to a promise he intended to keep. "Then we're just getting started," he said. Patrick opened the folder himself. He'd learned a long time ago that some things needed to be read in your own hands, not summarized by someone hoping to soften the landing. The first page was a list. 3 names, 3 flight dates, 3 seat numbers that had changed hands in the last 8 days alone, all routed through the same authorization code the cabin supervisor had used that morning. No documentation attached to any of them, no passenger complaint on file, though Patrick doubted that meant no passenger had minded. "Do we know who these people were?" he asked. The compliance officer who'd flagged the pattern shook her head. "Not yet. Names are in the system, but nobody followed up after the changes went through. No exit surveys, no customer service tickets." "Meaning nobody asked them how it felt," Patrick said, more to himself than to the room. He set the folder down and looked at the regional director, who hadn't sat back down since returning with it. "I want those 3 passengers contacted, not by the airline, by an independent line, so nothing about the outreach feels like damage control." She nodded, already reaching for her phone. Zoe stirred in the corner chair, blinking against the fluorescent light, momentarily unsure where she was. Patrick crossed the room and crouched beside her. "Hey," he said softly, "you've been asleep a while." She sat up straighter, pulling his jacket tighter around her shoulders, like she wasn't ready to give it back yet. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found more than I expected," Patrick said. "That's usually how it goes." She studied his face for a moment, the particular scrutiny children reserve for adults they're trying to read honestly. "Are you sad about it?" The question caught him off guard, mostly because it was the right one. "A little," he admitted. "I was hoping today would just be about you. Now it's about a lot more people than I planned for." Zoe considered that with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "Maybe that's okay. Mom always said the plan doesn't matter as much as what you do when it changes." Patrick didn't trust his voice for a second, so he just nodded and pulled her into a hug instead. Back at the table, the forensic specialist, who'd been quietly working through system logs since the room first assembled, finally looked up from his laptop, expression somewhere between vindicated and unsettled. "I think you're going to want to see this." Patrick returned to his seat. The specialist turned the laptop screen toward him, a spreadsheet filling the display, rows and rows of flagged entries stretching back further than anyone had expected to look. "Same authorization pattern," the specialist said. "Not 3 incidents, 31. Going back almost 2 years, all routed through variations of the same override code, all missing the documentation policy requires." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a number changes the entire shape of a conversation. 31 passengers, Patrick repeated. "At this airport alone," the specialist said. "We haven't pulled other locations yet." The regional director sat down slowly, the folder in front of her suddenly looking a great deal thinner than the problem it represented. "I need to understand how this went unnoticed for 2 years." "It didn't go unnoticed," Patrick said. "It went unreported. Those aren't the same thing. Somebody along the way saw a pattern and decided it wasn't worth the trouble of stopping." He thought about the businessman on the plane who'd assumed he was chasing a free upgrade, about the passengers who laughed along with Stephanie's toast rather than sit in the discomfort of disagreeing out loud, about how easy it was, in a moving system, for individual silence to add up into something that looked a lot like consent. "I'm not interested in punishing one supervisor for a culture that let this happen 31 times, Patrick said. "I want to know who benefited from it staying quiet." The compliance officer flipped to a new section of her notes. "There's an internal complaint log, 6 entries over the past 2 years, referencing similar seating disputes. All 6 were closed without escalation." She hesitated before answering. "Station management. Same office, different names on the sign-off each time." Patrick absorbed that without visible reaction, though something in his jaw tightened for the first time all morning. He'd expected carelessness. He hadn't expected a pattern deliberate enough to require repeated cover. Stefani appeared in the doorway again, this time without the sharpness she'd carried all morning. She looked smaller somehow, standing at the edge of a room that had stopped being about her seat preference several hours ago. "I didn't know any of this was happening," she said, quieter than anyone had heard her speak yet. "I just wanted the window seat." Patrick looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you didn't know. That's part of the problem. You didn't have to know. The system did the rest for you." She didn't have a response to that. For the first time since the flight began, neither did anyone else in the room. A gate agent stood a step behind Stephanie in the doorway, visibly working up the nerve to say something. She was young, maybe not long out of training, and her hands were laced together tight enough to whiten her knuckles. "I need to tell you something," she said, looking at Patrick rather than the room at large. "I should have said it earlier." Patrick gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Take your time." She sat, glancing once at Stephanie, who hadn't moved from the doorway, then back at Patrick, like she needed permission to keep going, even though he'd already given it. "Before boarding started, I saw Ms. Miller talking to the cabin supervisor near the jet bridge. I wasn't trying to listen. I was just standing there checking IDs." She swallowed. She mentioned her firm's contract a few times. Not as a threat exactly. More like a reminder. She said something about how people who take care of important clients usually have very successful careers. The room absorbed that in silence. She never told him to break policy, the gate agent added quickly, like fairness mattered even now. She just kept mentioning the contract until it seemed like he understood what she meant, without her having to say it directly. Stephanie's face had gone pale in the doorway. "That's not, I was making conversation." "Nobody's saying you gave an order," Patrick said, and his tone stayed level, careful not to flatten the nuance the gate agent had just handed him. "You didn't have to. That's the part worth sitting with." He turned back to the gate agent. "Thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy." She nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders now that the words were finally out of her. A second knock interrupted the quiet. The compliance officer returned with a man Patrick recognized from the flight, the businessman who'd been seated 2 rows up, the one who'd whispered about a free upgrade before he understood what he was actually watching. "I have something you should see," the businessman said, holding out his phone, noticeably less certain of himself than he'd been in his window seat that morning. "I recorded some of it. Wasn't sure if it mattered." Patrick took the phone and pressed play. The video was shaky at first, filmed from an angle low enough to suggest it had been shot discreetly, phone resting against a knee, but the audio was clean. Stefani's voice, sharp and certain. People dressed like that don't usually fly this cabin. The flight attendant's hesitation, the cabin supervisor's clipped instruction to relocate, and beneath all of it, barely audible but unmistakable once you knew to listen for it, Zoe's small voice asking if they'd done something wrong. Nobody in the room spoke while it played. When it ended, Patrick set the phone down gently on the table, the way you set down something heavier than its size suggests. This helps more than you know. The businessman looked at his own hands. "I almost didn't send it. Figured it wasn't my business." "It became everyone's business the second she asked if she'd done something wrong," Patrick said, nodding toward the corner where Zoe sat, still wrapped in his jacket, listening to a version of the morning played back through someone else's phone. An older woman appeared next, hovering uncertainly near the doorway, until the security officer waved her through. Patrick recognized her from the cabin, the passenger who'd looked down at her hands while Stephanie raised her champagne glass. "I should have said something on the plane," she said, voice unsteady. "I thought about it. I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved in someone else's seating dispute." She looked at Zoe. "I'm sorry I didn't." Patrick considered her for a moment before answering, choosing the words carefully. "Silence protects unfairness far more often than anger does. But you're here now. That counts for something." The woman nodded, blinking hard, and stepped back toward the door. Zoe had been quiet through all of it, watching adult after adult walk into the room and admit some version of the same thing, that they'd seen it happening and hadn't stopped it. When the woman left, Zoe finally spoke, her voice smaller than usual. Everybody just watched, she said. Nobody helped until it was already over. Patrick crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, meeting her eyes directly. People sometimes fail us, he said. That doesn't mean we stop believing people can do better. It just means we don't wait around for permission to expect it. She didn't answer right away, turning that over the way she turned over everything that mattered to her, slow and thorough. The lead investigator, a quiet man who'd been reviewing the video and the gate agent's statement side by side, finally looked up from his notes. This wasn't poor customer service, he said, flat and certain, the kind of sentence that closes one conversation and opens another. This was intentional. Nobody in the room disagreed with him. The lead investigator's words settled over the room like a verdict nobody needed spoken twice. This was intentional. Patrick let it sit there a moment before nodding toward the compliance officer. "Read the findings," he said. "All of it, no summarizing." She opened her laptop and began, methodical, unhurried, the way findings deserve to be read when they're about to change people's lives. 31 flagged reassignments across 2 years. 6 internal complaints closed without escalation, all signed off by the same station office. A pattern of preferential treatment tied directly to passenger wealth, and in several documented cases, race. The cabin supervisor's falsified reason code from that morning, now cross-referenced against the junior flight attendant's preserved screenshot and the businessman's video. Every sentence landed with the weight of something that couldn't be argued back into ambiguity. The regional director sat through it without interrupting, jaw tight, taking notes she likely didn't need since the printed report would land on her desk within the hour regardless. When the reading finished, she was the first to speak. "The cabin supervisor is terminated, effective immediately, for falsifying passenger records." She said it plainly, no hedging. "The station manager is suspended pending the wider review. I'll be recommending additional personnel actions once we understand how far up this went." Patrick nodded once. It wasn't triumph. It was the sound of a system finally doing what it should have done the first time, however many times ago that had been. Stephanie, still standing near the doorway where she'd retreated after the businessman's video played, cleared her throat. "What about me?" The director's gaze shifted to her, cooler now than it had been an hour earlier. "Your firm's account will be reviewed independently of this incident, but you'll no longer receive preferred customer status while that review is ongoing. Given what's on record today, that's the minimum response we can justify." Stephanie's mouth tightened. "This is going to embarrass me publicly. I hope you understand that." Patrick looked at her, not unkindly, but without softening anything either. "No, the truth is going to embarrass you. I just happened to be in the room when it caught up." She didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't had one for most of the last 2 hours. One of the airline executives who'd been quiet through most of the proceedings stepped forward then, hand extended, expression somewhere between professional damage control and something that looked, at least partly, genuine. "Mr. Herman, on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for how you and your daughter were treated today. It should never have happened, audit or not." Patrick shook his hand, but didn't let the moment linger. "I appreciate that, but I'm not looking for an apology. I'm looking for this not happening to the next family that doesn't have my job title to fall back on." The executive nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction the way a man absorbs something he hadn't expected to need to think about twice. "We'd like to make a statement," another executive added, from further back in the room. "Publicly recognize your role today. It would go a long way toward rebuilding trust with our customers." "I'd rather you rebuild the policy than rebuild my reputation," Patrick said. "Nobody needs to know my name for this to matter. They need to know it can't happen to them." The room went quiet at that, the particular quiet of people recalibrating what kind of man they were actually dealing with. He reached for a legal pad someone had left on the table and began writing, unhurried, the way he approached everything that mattered. When he finished, he slid it toward the director. No passenger downgrade without documented, verifiable justification, reviewed independently of the requesting party. Families and minor children cannot be separated during involuntary reassignment, except in genuine safety situations. Boarding staff must verify reservation records directly, not rely on customer assertion, regardless of who's asserting it. and employees who flag misconduct get protection, not silence. He tapped the last line. That one matters most. None of this surfaces today without a flight attendant deciding it was worth the risk to speak up. The director read the list twice before looking up. We'll implement all of it. I'll have legal review the language by end of day. Good, Patrick said, because a policy nobody enforces is just a sentence somebody wrote to feel better. Outside the conference room, word had already spread that a replacement aircraft was being prepared, delayed but moving forward, passengers slowly regathering near the gate, with the particular relief of people who'd spent hours not knowing what came next. Zoe tugged gently at Patrick's sleeve. Does this mean we're still going to DC? We're still going, Patrick said, and something in his chest loosened, for the first time since Stefani had first pointed her finger down that aisle. You've still got a competition to win. She smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her since before all of this started, and for a moment, the conference room, the findings, the folder full of 31 names, all of it faded slightly behind the much simpler fact that his daughter was smiling again. The regional director closed her own folder and stood. Your original seats have been restored on the replacement aircraft. First class, same assignment as this morning. Patrick thanked her, and didn't tell her yet what he already knew he was going to do with them. Zoe caught something in his expression anyway. She always did. Dad, she said slowly, what are you thinking? He didn't answer right away. Some things he'd learned were better shown than explained in advance. The gate area had filled back in by the time Patrick and Zoe made their way toward the new boarding line. Passengers from the original flight, mixing with a few new faces added to fill out the replacement aircraft. The mood was lighter than it had any right to be after a morning like this one. The particular relief of people who'd been stuck in limbo and were finally moving again. Patrick spotted the elderly couple near the far wall before Zoe did. The husband, a tall man in a faded veteran's cap, stood with one hand braced against a support column, the other steadying his wife as she lowered herself carefully into a row of gate seating. She moved slowly, deliberately, the kind of careful most people only learn after their body has recently reminded them it needs to be asked nicely. A cane rested against her knee. A folder of what looked like discharge paperwork peeked out of the tote bag beside her. Long morning for them too, looks like, Patrick said quietly. Zoe watched them for a moment. She looks tired. She looks like someone who probably shouldn't have been standing in a security line for 2 extra hours, Patrick said. He didn't decide anything dramatic in that moment. It wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration so much as the quiet, obvious next step in a morning that had already asked him to notice things other people walked past. He crossed the gate area with Zoe a step behind him and crouched slightly next to the husband's chair. Excuse me, are you both on the replacement flight to DC? The man looked up, surprised to be addressed at all, after a morning of being mostly invisible in the chaos. We are. Wife's not handling the delay too well, if I'm honest. She had surgery a few weeks back. Wasn't supposed to be sitting this long. Heart surgery? Patrick asked. The man nodded. Some old habit of not burdening strangers with details, evident in how briefly he answered. Patrick reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 2 boarding passes, the ones the regional director had returned to him not 20 minutes earlier, his and Zoe's original first-class seats, restored exactly as promised. He held them out. These are yours if you want them. The man blinked at the passes like they might be a joke he wasn't in on yet. Sir, we can't accept that. You don't even know us. I know you're 2 rows from boarding on a bad hip and worse timing, Patrick said. And I know your wife will be a lot more comfortable up front than she will be in the back for a flight this length. The wife had caught the exchange by now, her expression somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of tears she was clearly fighting not to let fall, in a crowded gate area. We couldn't possibly. You could, Patrick said gently. You'd be doing me a favor, honestly. We'll be fine back where we're seated. The husband looked at the passes, then at Patrick, then at Zoe, who was smiling in the particular way children smile when they already know exactly what's happening and approve completely. You're sure, he said, not quite a question anymore. I'm sure. The man took the passes with a hand that wasn't entirely steady, thanked him twice, then a third time, before Patrick finally stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. You don't owe me anything for this. Have a good flight. A few nearby passengers had noticed the exchange, the particular hush that spreads when strangers witness something that doesn't happen very often. An older woman 2 seats down wiped quickly at her eyes and pretended she hadn't. A gate agent who'd been quietly monitoring the boarding line for the last hour paused what she was doing entirely to watch. Zoe slipped her hand into her father's as they turned to walk back toward economy boarding. Exactly the section they'd been assigned before any of this morning ever happened. Except now, the walk felt different. Not like a punishment, like a choice. "Dad," she said, glancing up at him, "why did you give the seats away? You fought so hard to keep them." "We never fought for the seats," Patrick said. "We fought because someone thought fairness was something you could buy your way out of. If we'd let that stand, somebody else loses their seat next week for the same reason we almost lost ours." Zoe considered that the whole walk to the gate, quiet in the thoughtful way she got when something was rearranging itself in her mind. Boarding began a few minutes later, economy first this time by the captain's own request. An unusual break from standard procedure that nobody questioned given the morning they'd all had. As Patrick and Zoe stepped onto the jet bridge, the captain himself appeared near the door, having come out from the cockpit specifically to meet them. "Mr. Herman," he extended a hand, "I wanted to thank you myself before we're in the air." "You don't need to make an announcement," Patrick said preemptively, guessing where this might be headed. "I'd rather not have my title broadcast to a plane full of strangers." The captain smiled, the first easy smile Patrick had seen from any airline employee all day. "Wasn't planning to use your title. Figured I'd just tell them a father reminded this crew what fairness looks like. Didn't think you'd mind that version." Patrick considered it, then nodded once. "That version I can live with." As the cabin filled and the new aircraft prepared for departure, the captain's voice came over the intercom just briefly, a short line thanking the passengers for their patience and noting, without elaboration, that today's delay had led to an important reminder about how every passenger deserved to be treated the same way regardless of what seat they were in. A ripple of applause moved through the cabin, quiet but genuine, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to mean something. Zoe squeezed her father's hand as they settled into their seats, well back from first class, exactly where they'd been assigned all along. He had every reason to walk away from this morning holding on to those seats, and he gave them up anyway the second it mattered more to someone else. As the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, Patrick looked out the window at the tarmac sliding past, thinking not about the folder full of names or the policy changes now in motion, but about a promise made years ago in a hospital room to a woman who never got to see her daughter fly. He hadn't kept that promise by winning an argument. He'd kept it by refusing to let go of what actually mattered, all the way through. The plane leveled off somewhere above the clouds, and for the first time since Stephanie's finger had pointed down the aisle that morning, the cabin settled into the ordinary hum of a flight simply doing what flights do. Trays came down. A child a few rows up asked for pretzels. Somewhere behind them, someone laughed at something on their phone screen, the small, unremarkable sound of a day finally returning to normal. Zoe had her forehead against the window, watching the clouds spread out beneath them, like something solid enough to walk on. "You never really answered me," she said, without turning from the glass, "about why we fought so hard, if we were just going to give it away." Patrick thought about how to say it in a way she'd carry with her longer than the flight itself. Because if we'd let her have that seat just because she asked loud enough, we'd have told her, and everyone watching, that being right doesn't matter as much as being powerful. I wasn't going to let you learn that lesson before you turned 11. Zoe turned from the window to look at him. "So it was never really about the seat." "Never was," Patrick said. "Seats are easy to give away once you've proven you didn't need to take somebody else's dignity to earn one." She nodded slowly, tucking that away with the same care she'd tucked away everything else that morning, and rested her head against his shoulder as the plane hummed steadily eastward. He thought, not for the first time that day, about his wife, about the version of this trip she'd imagined, the two of them, somewhere over an ocean, hands loosely linked, no particular destination that mattered more than simply being there together. She never got that flight, but her daughter was on one now, heading towards something she'd earned entirely on her own, and Patrick let himself believe, quietly, that this counted as close enough to the promise he'd made in a hospital room 4 years earlier. The weeks that followed moved quickly, the way weeks tend to once a story like that one starts circulating beyond the people who lived it firsthand. The airline's new boarding policies went into effect within a month, documented, reviewed, publicized, in ways that made clear the changes weren't cosmetic. Independent audits became standard rather than exceptional. Mandatory training addressed unconscious bias in customer service decisions, not as a checkbox exercise, but as something employees were expected to actually absorb. Passenger complaints, once quietly closed by the same office that had let 31 reassignments slide for 2 years, now routed through an independent review board with no ties to station management at all. The junior flight attendant who'd quietly saved a screenshot because something about it felt wrong received a formal commendation and a promotion to lead cabin crew, the airline citing, specifically, her willingness to preserve the truth when it would have been easier to let it disappear. She would later say, in a brief internal newsletter feature nobody outside the company ever saw, that she hadn't done anything heroic. She'd just refused to pretend she hadn't noticed. Patrick never gave the public statement the airline had originally hoped for. No press conference, no headline with his name in it. He'd made that clear from the conference room table, and he held to it afterward, mostly because he meant it the first time he said it. The story that spread wasn't built around his identity. It spread because passengers who'd been on that flight, and a few who'd only heard about it secondhand, kept telling it anyway, in their own words, to people who needed to hear it. Zoe's robotics competition arrived 3 weeks later. The trip finally completed the way it had always been meant to be, minus the detour nobody had planned for. Her team's project, a low-cost water filtration prototype designed for communities without reliable infrastructure, placed first in its division. She stood at the podium in front of judges, parents, and a room full of strangers, and when it came time for the winning team to say a few words, she stepped up to the microphone without the nervousness Patrick had half expected. "My dad taught me something on an airplane a few weeks ago," she said, voice steady in a way that made him proud and slightly undone all at once. "People can take your seat. They can take your title, your reservation, whatever you were counting on that day, but they can never take your character unless you let them." The room applauded, the genuine kind, not the polite kind, reserved for kids at award ceremonies. Patrick watched from near the back, arms crossed, blinking harder than he wanted to admit in a room full of strangers. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and Zoe collected her trophy with the same careful two-handed grip she'd once reserved for her backpack, she found him near the exit doors. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" she asked, quieter now, just the two of them. Patrick looked toward the window, evening light spilling gold across the parking lot beyond it, and didn't hesitate before answering. "I know she would." They walked out together, her trophy catching the light, his hand steady around hers the way it had been steady through every version of that morning on the plane. Through boarding, through the falsified record, through the folder with 31 names in it, through the moment he'd handed 2 strangers a pair of boarding passes, because comfort mattered less to him than doing right by people who needed it more. None of it had started because Patrick wanted to prove anything. It started because a woman decided a jacket told her everything she needed to know about who belonged in a window seat, and a father decided, quietly, that he wasn't going to let that decision stand unchallenged, not for himself, and not for the next family who wouldn't have his job title to fall back on. The real seat he'd been fighting for was never listed on any boarding pass. It was the one Zoe now understood belonged to her by right, not by permission, not by anyone else's approval, wherever she chose to sit for the rest of her life. True greatness was never found in the front of that plane. It was found in the people who chose integrity when the entire cabin gave them every reason to choose something easier instead. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.